Oh no. No, 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 no. This was not good at all, Moore thought, while anxiously ruffling her fur. She looked up and down the grey halls of the hotel she and the rest of the crew of the GES-32 were staying at. Only rarely did someone leave their room, and when they did not stay in the hall for long, instead going to do whatever they needed to do. She was the only one loitering around in the hall like some kind of delinquent with nothing to do, and she wasn't comfortable with that at all. Maybe it was time to re-evaluate some things in her life that had led her into this position. In all of her years, she had never come into conflict with law and or order, and now would you look at her, keeping K for something that clearly went against both. When had her life gotten to this point? Nervously, she looked at the door she was guarding. So far everything was quiet, which was good, since even though her task was keeping guard, she had no idea what to do in case anything actually were to happen. She needed to calm down. So far, everything had happened the way she'd told her it would. As much as she didn't like to admit it, the petty officer knew what she was talking about, every now and then. Shortly after the feline had suddenly appeared in front of her door, she had pulled her and the rest of the group out to some shady corner of the station and handed them the strange small device that Curie had built for James. Everything went seemingly as planned after that. The warrant officer Reprigue had indeed left his room only a short while later, well groomed and brushed and seemingly in a hurry. When Pippa, who was either bolder or more careless than the rest of them, had checked the door, it turned out it was unlocked. And of course it was. What reason could someone have to lock a door in a place like this, which was well secured and surrounded by nothing but their co-workers and employees of the hotel? He felt safe, rightfully so. And now she would be the one to exploit and betray that feeling of safety. She had to admit, it made her feel pretty filthy, even if her intentions were pure. She herself could still not quite believe all of this talk about observations and sabotage, but the behaviour of the warrant officer had been suspicious, she had to admit that much. And James was so fully convinced of it all and had done such a good job of persuading Sheeda and Curie that maybe it was worth bending a few rules to grant them peace of mind. Pippa and Quiz certainly seemed to think so, as they were a lot less reluctant to help in their pursuits than Moore was. But even she had to admit that it would be too important to uncover something like this should they be right. And if they weren't, seeing that nothing was after them would surely calm them down and let normality return to all their lives. Although that still did not quite stop her conscience from stinging her as she got it for Quiz while they planted the device. It was quite the delicate operation. Based on the types and locations of the cameras in the halls, Curie had managed to devise a plan of their fields of view around the warrant officer's room. How exactly they did it so precisely, Moore had no idea, but they were absolutely convinced about their correctness. Luckily, most likely for privacy reasons, the cameras were positioned in such a way that did not actually allow them to see whether or not most of the doors are actually opened, since such a position would also allow them to see into the room whenever a door would have been opened. In Moore's opinion, it was the only thing that made this operation possible at all, although Curie and Sheeda had insisted that it merely made it easier for them. In fact, she had been surprised, and not just slightly concerned, how quickly Sheeda had found a way to easily exploit what seemed to be a minor flaw to her. When she had mentioned that, the young woman had just laughed at her and asked if this was a minor flaw, what would she even consider to be a major one? The effrontery of that girl knew no bounds. But if Moore was honest with herself, she never had to think too much about her personal safety. At least apparently not nearly as much as someone from a more dangerous world had to. Putting their heads together, Sheeda and Curie had managed to quickly make a plan that would get at least one of the group into the room undetected, if everything went smoothly. This most dangerous part of actually invading the privacy of the room had fallen onto Quiz. Apparently already anticipating that the question why she didn't do it herself would come up, Sheeda had already included the explanation in her plan. Since she was not supposed to be around the hotel at all, having booked another room along with James quite a bit away, her involvement would be too suspicious. And as curious circumstances made it hard for them to do nearly anything undetected, the last possible option had been Quiz. To Moore's surprise, they had not been nearly as perturbed by that revelation as she had expected. They merely asked what the plan was exactly. Using her own and Pippa's much larger forms as cover from the camera's views, Quiz was to slip into the room undetected. There, they would place the device, hopefully remaining undetected, and then give a signal that they were ready to leave, at which point Moore and Pippa would create another window for them to escape the room. So long as their friend and colleague remained in the room, the two women would stand guard and make sure no unforeseen third party, or worse, the warrant officer himself, would catch them in the act. The plan sounded too simple to work for Moore. However, Sheeda had insisted. The simpler it is, the less chance there is for one of you to screw it up. And as lax as security is in that place, doing anything more complicated only introduces more room for error. She had also added something about the captain being cheap, finally paying off for something, but Moore had not really listened to that part. "Stick to the plan and you'll be fine," Moore repeated to herself in her head. The time was crawling around her, like the feeling of bugs was crawling along her skin. It seemed like Chris had already been in that room for ages. How long could it take to place such a small device in an inconspicuous way? Or had her own perception of time just gone completely awry under all this stress? On the other side of the hall, she could see Pippa peek around the corner for a moment, looking at her questioningly. Trying to seem casual, she gave a sign of no back to the medic, causing her to curl her lips nervously. Apparently the young woman was also getting impatient. Oh, this was not good at all. What was Chris doing in there? Pippa quickly returned to her role position, leaving Moore standing alone once more. It did not ease her worries in the slightest that James was preoccupied with more important duties, and she therefore had to rely solely on information and plans devised by Curie and Sheeda, two individuals that did not exactly have trustworthy written all over them. Although she also knew that he would most likely have just told her to listen to the two of them. After all, he seemed to hold them and their abilities in strangely high regards for someone in his position. She was pulled out from her thoughts as voices suddenly came into earshot. High, clear voices talking quickly with each other. Oh no. She could feel panic building up within her, and exhorted herself to remain calm, as her fur slowly standing up in places gave her the feeling of even more bugs crawling across her skin, causing her to quickly comb it all back into place with her claws. "Come on, Tyseal, you haven't been around in ages," the higher of the two voices said, as they came into earshot. "You didn't even call me most of the time, and you told me once your crew stopped here we could finally spend some time together." The pleading voice was met with an exhausted and unsure-sounding sigh. "I know I told you that, and I really thought we could," the lower voice answered, apparently belonging to someone called Tshirt. And they were just getting so close by now that there was no mistaking it. They were heading right towards her. "It's just, stuff has gotten more complicated since then, and I can't just leave my team hanging. It was a miracle that I got this position in the first place, after all. I can't just blow it on my first important task." Moore had to suck in a deep breath as the two figures finally rounded a corner, coming into view. Large figures clad colourful feathers with a dark, violet basis that made them look almost unnatural. Their mouths were formed to hook beaks, and their arms were formed into large, wide wings. Sharp claws scratched along the floor as they walked. They were Xanathai, core warders belonging to the renowned order of the Psychocenes, and apparently there was trouble in paradise. Luckily, this seemed to mean that they did not have any eye for paying attention to the lonely Raphaelite standing around in the halls, definitely being suspicious. Moore could only hope they would keep ignoring her, and just quickly did whatever they came here to do. It was a bit strange, however. She recognized neither of them, although according to their little squabble, the one with the deeper voice had to be part of the crew of the GES, didn't he? "And what is this task that is so important?" the other alien asked agitatedly, as they quickly traversed the halls, walking right past Moore. Out of the corner of her eye, she could see Pippa once more peek around the corner, before quickly putting her head back in surprise as she saw the new arrivals. "You know I can't tell you that," Tshirt said determinedly. But then, suddenly their tone changed, and they looked away from what was presumably their partner in some way. "But, well..." The partner looked up at that and pried further. "Well?" Tshirt let out another sigh, just like the one before. "I'm sorry, I really am, but with the way things are going, it just doesn't seem like things will get much better anytime soon," the avian admitted subduedly while looking away. "To be completely honest, it sounds like things will get even more hectic. I'm afraid I won't be able to make good on my promise." The partner's head shifted in an erratic manner, as they seemed to try to take in every detail about the avian's meek appearance with their stiff eye. Their irritation from before seemed to have evaporated at the humble display, as they whispered, "Just what are you doing? I know you can't tell me, but you are worrying me." They reached out with their hand, their wing unfolding itself over that of their partner. The address looked down at their interlocked wings, and then up at their partner's face again. "Yeah, I know, I'm sorry," Tshirt said, with a bit of life returning to their voice with each word. "You don't have to be worried, it's just that..." However, they did not finish, as a sound erupted through the hall, and at the most inopportune time possible. Everyone froze up for a second, Moore most of all. That had been the signal. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw that she had not been the only one to notice that. Pippa had come around the corner, but looking at the two avians blocking the hall, she had stopped, unsure of what to do now. Right, that was something that they should have done, Moore remembered now. Neither of them had remembered to let Quist know that it was not safe in the hall for the moment, and to wait until the corridor was once again empty, but now it was too late. Now they could only hope. What was that? The Xanathai, with a higher voice, who still held their partner comfortingly, asked and looked around the hall. However, Tshirt had been quite a bit faster, as their head had almost immediately turned towards the source of the noise. They eyed the door to the warrant officer's room suspiciously for a moment. Then their gaze fell onto the room's number. And the blood froze in Moore's veins, as she could see their posture changed as they seemingly needed to take a surprise step back, their pupils constricting to tiny dots. She could hear her heartbeat loudly into her ears. Was this it? For a moment, time seemed to stand still. However, whatever it was that had caused the avian's clear reaction, the realization of what room it was they were looking at, it was something that seemed to cause just as much stress as Moore herself felt at that moment. Quickly, Tshirt grasped for the hand of their partner, pulling them along quickly. "Let's not talk about that here," they said, as their partner made a surprised sound and staggered to catch up, as to not get dragged along by the tight grip on their hand. They seemed to try to ask some questions, but couldn't quite find their voice, as the two avians hurriedly disappeared away out of the corridor and towards another row of rooms around the next corner. Moore could only look after them. She stared for a good few seconds before slowly letting out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Her heart was still pounding a lot harder than she was comfortable with, and she took a moment to shake off the shock that sat in her bones. A hopping sound from in front of her announced Pippa making her way towards her. "You alright?" the young woman asked and looked up at Moore's face. "All of this isn't good for my health," Moore quietly lamented, before shaking out her limbs and standing up straight. At that moment, Quist's signal repeated itself once more, as they were apparently unsure why no one had reacted to them the first time. Getting into that awkward caravan-like formation they needed to hold in order to block out the camera's view again, the two large women made their way through the corridor. As they approached the door in question, Pippa gave a signal back to Quist by loudly thumping her tail onto the floor. The door slid open, revealing Quist waiting on the other side. Everyone most likely had multiple questions, but they couldn't stop now. Hoping that they did not mess up the admittedly simple but also rather precise movements, they allowed Quist to slip in between them as they continued their awkward walk through the hotel. A pit forming in her stomach told Moore that they just had to have been spotted. This all seemed more and more like a terrible idea. However, they had also not been called out by anyone yet, despite somebody surely having an eye on the security feed. As their nerves didn't allow the group to stay around the scene of their crime any longer, they did not stop at any of their rooms, instead quickly making their way out of the hotel. "Goodness, Quist, you sure took your time?" Pippa was the first of them to speak once they were out on the street and out of earshot of anyone who could have seen them loitering in the halls beforehand. "What took you so long?" Quist, who had some trouble keeping up with the two giants, as they were not going at the usual slow pace, allowing them to easily catch up, could only answer briefly for the moment. "I got distracted," they signed. Moore looked down at her old friend worriedly. While Quist may have been a bit less concerned about the whole ordeal than she herself was, she did have to wonder what could have been interesting enough to distract them in a situation like this one of all things. Observing them further now that she could, they did seem rather shaken, actually. It was rare to see Quist this reminiscent, and a bad feeling befell the old woman as she studied them hurrying alongside her. Pippa, the shock of the feeling of almost being busted obviously still on her mind, tried to shake off her nervousness by talking. The young woman also seemed to not have picked up on the oppressive atmosphere filling the air. "So, that was a close call, huh?" she started rumbling, trying to sound more amused than worried as she hopped along. "Wonder what those two were talking about. Seemed important. And the one guy got in a real hurry all of a sudden, whatever that was about." Moore didn't quite have the nerve to think about the problems of other people right now. She also didn't really feel like talking herself and wondered how Pippa could do both of those things in a situation like this. However, she did appreciate someone breaking the silence. "We might have been luckier than we want to admit to ourselves," she said, despite her unwillingness, and thought back. If they were honest with themselves, even if they had achieved what they had set out to do, it was by no means due to their flawless execution. "Yeah, maybe we shouldn't tell Sheeta about that part," Pippa responded a bit more nervously, her ears flicking in place a few times. "Wouldn't want to get her needlessly riled up, long as James is not around." A sound from around her feet informed Moore that Quiz apparently found that proposition rather amusing. By now, they had gained a good bit of distance to the hotel, and were about to enter the general traffic of the station. Without splitting up and allowing Quiz to use a more appropriate walkway for them, things would soon get rather complicated, so they avoided a big part of the bustling surroundings and made a sharp turn towards the nearby gastronomy. They all could most likely use something to calm their nerves by now. Lowering herself at a nearby table with a sigh, Moore helped Quiz up onto the plates while Pippa took a place opposite of them. It was a nice small gastronomy with a few tables out in front, allowing a view of the passing business at the station. At this time, few other customers had found their way here, and most of them seemed to prefer the more isolated atmosphere inside the establishment, so the group had some room to themselves. While they waited for a waiter to notice them, Quiz, who was breathing a bit heavily from the earlier exertion of hurrying alongside the two giants, finally asked, "What happened earlier?" Moore and Pippa explained their encounter with the two strange avians in hushed voices, while Quiz listened carefully. For Moore, the gravity sank in more and more. Not only did she still feel bad about the whole thing, hoping that whatever they would find out was indeed worth the stark intrusion into someone else's private sphere, she also had to come to terms with all of them having done a pretty bad job at it. Throughout her life, the old lady had considered herself to be quite capable, but now she found herself in the position that even all three of them had apparently not had the awareness to follow even the simplest plan that Sheeta could come up with. Maybe it was unfair to compare herself to someone who was quite literally built for things like this, in a way, especially since Moore had not ever done nor had ever felt the desire to do something like this. At least she told herself that. But the feeling of inadequacy that was building up inside her was not quite so easily extinguished. "So, you want to tell us what exactly distracted you now?" Pippa asked Quiz, and Moore could hear that one of her feet was impatiently thumping the floor over and over. Quiz gave an affirming sign, but shook themselves out and stretched their limbs before answering. "Some of the stuff in the room was not what I expected," they finally explained, while moving their head to look back and forth between Pippa and Moore. That didn't sound good. Quiz had been around quite a bit during their life, so seeing something that they did not expect must have been something quite strange. As she thought about what they might have found, she was reminded another time that intruding into someone else's privacy like this was not right. However, the look in Quiz's eyes gave her pause. "What did you find in there?" she asked, leaning down towards her small friend and colleague. Quiz seemed a bit unsure of their answer as they signed, "Nothing." "Nothing?" Moore and Pippa simultaneously let out, leaning in closer to them in surprise. "Nothing," Quiz repeated soberly, not reacting to their little outburst in the slightest. Or more precisely, not enough. The room was almost untouched. I know we haven't been here long, and I also know the rooms get cleaned regularly, but that cabin, it just didn't feel lived in, so to speak. So little was unpacked that I had trouble finding any place where the camera wouldn't be suspicious. The bed was unslept in, and not only that, but everything was unnervingly clean, apart from the few areas he clearly used to get ready earlier. The contrast was uncanny. It was a strange thing to notice, however that somehow made it sound a lot more believable. This was not just something anybody would randomly come up with, much less Quiz. Nobody would know better than Moore how hard it was to keep a room clean when somebody with a coat of fur was inhabiting it, no matter how neatly one tried to live. "But what does that mean?" Pippa asked with a ruminative look on her face. Moore had no answers for her, as the strange detail somehow felt important indeed, although she could not say why or how in the least. "I don't really know either," Quiz answered, "but it feels significant somehow." Things fell quiet for a while, during which they also finally were able to make their orders. For a moment, the absolute carelessness of the waiter as they interacted with them seemed almost strange to Moore, until she remembered that she was neither in the company of Deathworlders, nor in that of a tiny, unnerving cyborg at the moment. No one around them would guess that anything strange was happening with this little group, seemingly enjoying a day out. The entire stress of the day was something their surroundings were completely unaware about, and even though they had broken multiple rules today, no one would treat them any differently for it. And Moore did not know how comfortable she was with that. Not at all. Finally, after a long period of silence, Quiz said, or more precisely signed, what they were all secretly thinking. I really hope it is nothing, but whatever it means, I hope it will tell the others more than it does us. Breathe in, and breathe out. His inner voice rang through James's head. In and out. Calm yourself. There is nothing to fear but fear itself. Being given some time to steel himself this time, he was determined not to make a fool of himself once again. He was the master of his emotions. He was in control. He would not let himself be overwhelmed. The task ahead was a monstrous one, but he would persevere. Although the day that was before him really was far from his idea of ideal, then again, these weren't the first bigwigs he would have to entertain, but they certainly were the most unnerving ones. At least one of them was. The command area of the station was just as busy as the rest of it, but there was a noticeable increase in organisation of the chaos as he further and further left the part of the station used by normal people. This was the place where this entire megastructure was managed and kept running after all. The amount of planning and organisation necessary must have been enormous, and it also took an enormous amount of people. The buildings around him had turned more monotone with each step he took. The entire area was grey and blocky and obviously designed in an entirely communal effort. However, he was not here for the bureaucrats and personnel surrounding him right now. He was here for the big boss herself. Since it was the most formal thing he had with him, he once again donned the ship's uniform he had gotten used to over the last months. His face was actually clean-shaven for once, and his hair, although still too long for his liking, was groomed. Even if no one would notice the effort he had put into his appearance, nobody would be able to accuse him of not trying. Apparently his arrival had been foretold, as every possible barrier he encountered made way for him as quickly as possible, although he had to admit it was still the tightest security he had encountered since he left the human territories. Even if it was clear they wanted to stop him for as little time as possible, he was checked for weapons or dangerous items multiple times before arriving at the core of the command area. Checkpoints were tightly managed and strictly guarded by armed security. Many of them were even better equipped than the ones that had come to stop his fight the previous night. He saw multiple stopping weapons on many of them, along with a multitude of more lethal options. The presence of that many guns made even him a little nervous as he pressed on into the unknown. The personal office of the matriarch he finally found himself in front of really was more of an entire building. The enormous tubular structure stood almost completely alone in the middle of the station's floor, forcing the numerous walkways used by people of different sizes to snake around it instead of going straight any longer. James swallowed heavily, looking at the titanic entrance. After usually being one of the tallest people in the room at any given time back on Earth, it had taken him some time to get used to feeling small, surrounded by giants out in space, but he had managed that, and it didn't bother him anymore. But standing in front of the towering grey walls and the absolutely massive door built into them, he didn't just feel small. In and out. In control. He looked down at his arm, onto his personal assistant, which he had dug out of his suitcase again just for this specific occasion. Nothing secretive going on today, so he might as well wear it. It was still fashionably early, even though the multiple stops and searches on his way had slowed him down more than expected. He was fully aware that many of the different sensors that were surely integrated into the door were already picking up his presence. And indeed, before he had even finished signing his request to open, the different parts of the door were already set in motion, causing quite a bit of noise as the heavy bars moved into place while making way for him. As no one stepped out to welcome him, he guessed it was on him to enter. Passing the threshold with the giant doors closing behind him gave his mind pause for a moment, as he pondered how impossible it would be to pass them should they stay closed. Silently he traversed the room, his footsteps silenced by the thick carpet padding on the floor. It seemed the red carpet possibly transcended species borders, or maybe he was just projecting a meaning onto it. It still felt like a strangely grand gesture walking along the enormous hallway. To both of his sides, the corridor was decorated with statues of different species, most of which he recognized as giant core welders. Between them stood what were most likely supposed to be some decorative plants. However, to James, they were more like trees, standing at least 4 meters tall, although many of their stems were a rich green instead of brown, and most had not bark to speak of. The room was large enough that it seemed to just swallow sound. The silence was eerie. This really felt like entering some sort of different world, one he did not feel all too welcome in. And, as if that unwelcoming feeling was not enough, he soon found himself in front of yet another door, surrounded by what looked to be a sort of waiting area. Along with the decorations from before, benches of different sizes now also placed before the walls, and regular spaces in the floor were covered in what looked like tick futons to him. Apparently, many people were quite regularly forced to spend a good bit of time here. However, right now it was empty, and he was alone. Apparently, the schedule had been cleared. For a person as important as the Leader Supreme, he wondered how complicated it must have been to accomplish even something seemingly as mundane as that. Looking back at the door, he realized that it wasn't an automated one. It was huge, and seemingly carved out of one single massive piece of hardwood. Whatever tree it was taken from must have been at least the size of a giant sequoia at some point. And looking up, high above his head, he could see a massive brass handrail to it. He assumed it was a door handle analog, and it was so high above the ground that he wasn't sure if any species except for a Zodiatos could comfortably reach it to open the door. As a human, he couldn't even try to. Making sure that the door would not open in his direction, he stepped in front of it. Standing so close really made him feel minuscule in comparison. And then he knocked, loudly. In an almost embarrassing moment, he wasn't even sure if he had hit the door hard enough for the sound to make it through. But, apparently, he had. Around him, wind picked up and blew past his face and through his hair, as the colossal piece of wood came into motion, sucking air into the ream as it opened. He steeled himself for what was behind it. In and out. In control. Knowing what to expect this time, he already tilted his head all the way back to look up at the Titan, surely opening the door. And as his eyes fell on the massive face, he blinked in surprise. Now, he had not met many Zodiatos, and his face recognition wasn't entirely designed to distinguish them, but he was pretty sure that whoever stood in front of him there wasn't the High Matriarch. "Hello there!" A higher than expected, excited voice boomed down towards him, as the face of the Colossus quickly came closer to his, causing him to stagger back. Just as the Matriarch had done at their first meeting, this new person also reached out their trunks, most likely trying to pet him. And while he wasn't as taken by fear as he had been the last time, he was still very sure that he didn't want to be touched, so he quickly took some steps back while trying to maintain a polite posture and looking up at their face. "Hello," he said, as upbeat as he could manage while trying to force his rapidly beating heart back into a steady rhythm. "Who do I have the pleasure with? I'm supposed to meet with the Leader Supreme here." Putting their trunk back seemingly disappointedly, the large head of the Zodiatos shifted, and the eyes of one side of their face seemed to focus on him. Their eyes were so far from him that he couldn't really make them out, perceiving them as only black dots in their face. It must have been even worse from their perspective. "Is that the ambassador?" A more familiar voice finally rang out from inside the office, causing the Colossus to turn around surprisingly. "Yeah, Aunt Apo, I think it's him," they said, their voice still booming through the air way too loudly. Someone had to have taught them an inside voice at some point, right? Also, Aunt Apo? So this was the High Matriarch's niece. Or her nephew, maybe. No, definitely niece. Impatiently, the voice of the Leader Supreme herself answered. "Then what are you doing? Ask him in already." As if to heed the command, the presumed girl turned towards James again and opened her mouth, but he was quicker. "I heard her," he said, while raising an arm and starting through the door. The Zodiatus made room for him, which was mostly a gesture since he would have had no problem walking straight under her legs. Then again, he was happy that he didn't have to do that, as even walking past her tree trunks of legs was enough to send a shiver along his back. In the room, a surprising amount of people came into view, looking back at him. Alongside Madame Tua herself, the most notable members were Warrant Officer Reprieg and Captain Markoatonc himself. He was quite surprised, as he had expected Reprieg to be around, but not to be a planned addition to tonight's events. Also present were some unknown faces. One of them he recognized from the statues in the hallway. A striped cedar with long, lanky limbs, and a very heavy-looking tail, providing counterbalance for their turtle-like shell and wide head. Their stiff lips were curled in a way that gave their face a goofy-looking smile, and their eyes were divided by 4 slit-like nostrils on their forehead. The other one was quite bizarre. James assumed that they must have been close to an amphibian, but it was hard to discern that. They sat on the ground, crouched, their 5 large black eyes staring at him emotionlessly out of their wide face that was crowned with some bright red coloration on the top of their head. Their skin was pinkish, mottled, and over covered in villi-like extrusions, giving them an almost fuzzy look. Were they not so glossy? Their elongated and laterally flattened body didn't look like they could walk upright very well, so they would most likely have to crawl along the ground using all 8 of their eerily spindly limbs. Had it not been for the elephants in the room, they would most likely have made the list as the most terrifying encounter today. However, James paid attention to neither of them, and instead looked around the room with pretended interest, if only to gain a moment to breathe after the over-enthusiastic greeting. The red carpet remained even in the room, and 2 even larger trees than the one in the hall stood to either of his sides, their outside membranes showing an almost turquoise colour. The statues had been replaced with paintings, showing the nightmare of what James guessed was the matriarch's family. He even thought he could make out the niece's face on one of the smaller figures, as the drawn facsimiles stared lifeless out of the canvas. All in all, this could have been any expensive office he knew, just scaled up by 10. "I hope the invitation found you well, Ambassador," Madame Tour finally greeted him, standing behind a massive desk to which the typical copious amount of computer screens was attached via framework. Even the large people in the room would not have been able to look over the table, yet it looked completely normal-sized in front of the Leader Supreme. James took a deep breath. In and out. Then he looked up at the monstrous face, the eerie black eyes staring back at him, still giving him goosebumps and making his heart pump all the way up to his ears, but he remained in control. "Greetings, High Matriarch. Well, on Earth each invitation usually grants at least a +1, he explained, managing to keep his voice steady. He would have to remain in control for so long until he was used to this company, and he really hoped that he would, but otherwise I cannot complain. Casually, he let his eyes drop towards the other people in the room again. "Captain, Warrant Officer?" He greeted the 2 people who he knew personally with a quick nod towards each of them. Rapri shifted his trunk disapprovingly and studied him with a somber expression, while Captain Uton approached him enthusiastically. "James, how are you? Is the station up to your expectations so far?" The large primate loudly boomed as he approached his crew member and reached out one of his giant hands to pat James on the shoulder, which he allowed him to do this time. "It has been quite exciting so far," James said, and couldn't help but put on an impish smile while he sheepishly scratched the back of his head. Making eye contact with the captain for a moment, the large man seemed to have a mixture of feelings inside of him as he thought about what the researcher could mean by that. Deciding to change the topic quickly, James said, "Although I do feel a bit singled out here, maybe some introductions are in order." Indeed. It seemed that the eyes in the room were quite transfixed on the new arrival, and it was quite obvious that he didn't need to be introduced to anybody. "Why, of course," the loud voice of the matriarch answered in the captain's stead, as her colossal form stomped around her huge desk to join the round, so to speak. James looked back and forth between the 2 completely unknown people. He couldn't really read their faces, as one seemed to look at him constantly happy, and the other seemed like he had just stolen their seat at the cinema. And then there was of course the second Soldatios, who was still a complete wildcard to him, and who he had been forced to turn his back towards for quite a while now, which was something that didn't sit right with the back of his mind at all. "Ambassador James Aldwin," Madame Tour finally said, taking up position at his front tent, massively towering over him, putting on her "things are getting official" voice. "With great pleasure, I, High Matriarch Apogenoria Adoxia Tua, and Leader Supreme of the GCS, welcome you, who presents Earth, her people and humanity as a whole here tonight. Allow me to introduce everyone." Representing Earth, her people and humanity as a whole? James thought, while looking into the round one more time. He had used that formulation himself before, however, it being done in such an official setting filled him with all sorts of imposter syndromes. I am so going to blow this.